Hey there everyone, and welcome back to Afrodo Reviews. On this channel, I help you decide, is that book worth reading over a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. It's not the first time we've done this today. Alright. Today's book is something of a unique case. It is God of War by J.M. Barlog, who I honestly think should switch the R and the L in his name. Then he could be J.M. Balrog. And who doesn't want to be named after a Balrog? But it was officially published on August 28th of 2018, a full 4 months after the release of the video game, which makes a certain kind of sense, but I'll get more into that in the review section. This makes it unique among the various other books I've reviewed on this channel in that it's the first novelization of another media type I've reviewed, at least on this channel. Though I've contemplated it before with the Iron Man novelization, which I do own, or the Raimi's first Spider-Man movie novelization, another own, or even finally reviewing the much-loved novelization of The Revenge of the Sith, God of War officially earns the title of being the very first novelization I've read on this channel. And I'll focus more on that later. To talk about the book's background involves me discussing the background of the God of War series in general. So let's go ahead and get started in that regard.
I have lived as a warrior. I have died as a god, having suffered the ultimate sacrifice.
The God of War franchise follows Kratos, a Spartan warrior, son of Zeus, who sold his soul to Hades to become a powerful warrior, only to be betrayed by the gods when Ares tricks him into killing his wife and daughter in a bloodthirsty haze. Forever marked with the ashes of his now murdered family, Kratos begins his quest of vengeance against the gods, starting with Ares in the first game, but before long wiping out the entire Greek pantheon in a blood-soaked orgy of vicious violence. But don't let this fool you. Despite the backstory, Kratos was far from the nicest guy around. In fact, some might argue that the vengeful Spartan warrior was probably worse than the gods themselves, paying no care to who he hurt in his collateral damage, and often killing more than one innocent person simply to achieve his goals.
I am what the gods have made me!
Or just because he wanted to. That's who Kratos was. After the ending of God of War 3 and realizing the horror he's inflicted on Greece in his war against the gods, Kratos has since tried to leave that past behind. He has moved on, traveling until he has arrived in the Norse realm of Midgard. Here he met with Faye, who after some time he fell in love with and married. At least in a certain sense. The two lived in peace for a long while, having a son named Atreus, a young sickly child who spent more time with his open mother than his closed-off father, until the day Faye dies, and, seeking to fulfill her last wish, the two go to spread her ashes from the highest mountain in all of the 9 realms. They think at first that's in Midgard, but it turns out it's in the highest mountain in all the realms is in Jotunheim, the realm that's been sealed off from Midgard for centuries now. And that's about all the context you really need to know when going into this work. In fact, I kind of gave you a little bit extra and talked about the actual synopsis of this book, but for that being said, here's the report card. You have to forgive me. I did this recording once already, but that recording didn't turn out too well, so. But let's move on to the cover. Now, the cover is just the game cover. Yeah, I mean, I can't fault it. Not even the same way I faulted the cover for Resistance Gathering Storm, because this is just a novelization, and the game cover is perfectly appropriate for it to have in that case. It's literally telling the same story. It's not telling an extended lore story. It's not telling a in-between story. It's not doing an AU story. It's just the same story, but in novel form. And as a cover for a game, it goes pretty well. One of the things I did like about having it in a book format is because since I played the game digitally, I didn't actually own a physical copy. One of the things I noticed here that I didn't notice when I bought the game was you can actually see Mimir in the cover. He's hanging off Kratos' belt where he always is. And I thought that was pretty cool because Mimir is like one of my favorite characters in this new saga. In fact, he's such my favorite character that when I found out that his voice actor actually read the audiobook of this novelization, it took everything in my power not to just go buy that and then reread the whole book just to hear his voice reading it out loud. But what is this story about, you might ask? Well, I kind of already told you part of it above. Really, the only bit of extra context I need to provide is a couple things. Well, first, if you're interested in seeing how this book presents itself, shameless plug time, check out my TBR. But for the most part, the ending of that little section up ahead sums it up fairly nicely. The story follows Kratos and his son Atreus as they attempt to fulfill the last wish of his wife Faye and spread her ashes from the highest peak in the Nine Realms. Initially, they believe it's on Midgard. They are forced to find a way to Jotunheim, the sealed realm of the giants, to accomplish the task, all while coming into conflict with the Norse pantheon of gods, including a stranger who seems invulnerable to all damage. So, what did I think of this story? Well, obviously, I loved it. At least, I loved the game when I played it. It's funny because when I picked up this book, I was taking a risk. And it's a risk I knew I was taking, but I could read this book and find that it had almost no difference between the game and the novelization to make it worth talking about. It is, after all, telling the exact same story, merely changing the medium in which that story is told. And while you can do certain things in a book that you can't do in a game, and vice versa, I couldn't really get mad at the book for telling the same story the same way. I was hoping, at best, that this would have been like Revenge of the Sith, where I've often heard that it so greatly expands and fleshes out the character work that it's basically a superior version to the movie. And there were plenty of scenes I could think of from the game that would have been great for this. I mean, after all, if we're not controlling Kratos and have to be focused on him all the time, we didn't need a new fight or puzzle every 5 minutes to keep us distracted, right? You could tell a more narratively focused tale, and you didn't have to solely follow Kratos to do so. But after finishing it, I realized this book provides a perfect opportunity to really discuss certain aspects when it comes to writing. Specifically, why the small things matter to a story. Because this book does change and omit some things, but it changes and omits just enough in such a way that it ultimately delivered a far weaker experience than simply just playing the game. But first, let's start with the more minor complaints that I have of this story. I say minor in comparison because these are relatively decent complaints. For example, this is a novelization, which means if you're reading this, you're getting the same story. But the story in the novelization is very aware that it's a novelization. What I mean by that is, instead of trying to write this from the perspective that this book can be read disconnected from the game, it feels like it was written with the intent of being read after the games had already been played. So little effort is put into making this an interesting read that I honestly wouldn't blame people for DNFing this work. It's a very bullet point summary of the events that occur within the game, with an almost bored narrator recapping this for his kid for the 6th time in a week because the kid won't shut up. Most of the time, it doesn't try to do anything new with the set pieces or the events that occur in the game, which is unfortunate because it did have a real opportunity to do so. Personally, I think the story would have been best if they had stuck to Atreus' perspective, at least until we have to follow Kratos, like his brief journey into the light of Alfheim, or his first visit to Helheim. It would allow for a new audience member to be in the boy's shoes as they try to unwrap the enigma that is his father, Kratos, juggling if Kratos actually even likes Atreus, or why he is the man he is, the gruff, no-nonsense man who is very laconic. I think it's said laconic. A couple of the times the book does actually try to add a few things. Like during that time in Alfheim, you get to see from the perspective of Atreus during some of the scenes where Kratos is in the light. Now, from Kratos' perspective, and our own, since we're controlling him, we're only gone for about 5 or so minutes in this scene. But when we get back and you see the mounds of Dark Elf bodies, and hear Atreus' words, you hear the desperation in his voice, we realize that we've been gone a lot longer, and we don't know how long. It's a real gut punch of a scene, as just before this, we learn Atreus genuinely doesn't believe his father loves him, and would abandon him if he couldn't keep up. The book tells us some of this scene through Atreus' perspective, and while that's a great idea, even though I feel the book kind of miffs that a little bit, to be completely honest with you, but again, I'll go into that a little bit later. And while it doesn't quite go to the full potential it could have, it does still show us the initial bits of Atreus waiting for Kratos, revealing that he had to wait at least a day, and showing the creeping concerns he has. But again, it's so far and few between that the author actually took advantage of the fact he can switch perspectives from Kratos, or add things that would have detracted from a gameplay experience. Most of the addition in the book mostly consists of the author being like, yeah, it didn't actually take Kratos 5 minutes to walk all the way across Midgard. It actually takes several days. And you know what? They do have to eat and sleep. You know, the kind of stuff most people just kind of assume the characters are doing when we aren't playing them. Because playing character through their eating, sleeping, and taking days to walk across the map isn't really that fun to do. At least, not in this kind of game. I mean, he could have done the exact opposite. Instead of adding small things to assure us that the world isn't actually this small, and yes, Kratos does in fact need to eat and sleep, guys. I'm just glad he stopped in and showed Kratos taking a shit somewhere. He could have cut the various fight scenes with just random encounters, things that weren't needed, and used it to expand other parts. I mean, it's not like he does much with these fight scenes that he does keep in, as most are over in a paragraph, or 2 if it was a boss creature, and then the duo move on without a glance backwards to what just happened. It literally, most of them can be summed up with, Kratos took out his axe, slash, 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 they were all dead. Furthermore, the author violates the show don't tell rule a lot in this story, oftentimes just directly stating how characters feel or what they're thinking. The game is an objectively better experience in this regard, as it doesn't have the benefit of just being able to tell you stuff. So they have to do, without words, showing you how a character is feeling with their actions and their expressions. The matter-of-fact way it just states, this character felt, or this character thought, isn't great for immersion. You're merely just being told what to feel or what to think about the various character interactions that pepper the work. In addition, it has the same problem that Grey Griffins had when I reviewed that, in that it doesn't really know how to end chapters sometimes. It occasionally will leave off on a good chapter break, like when Mimir requests that you cut off his head. For someone who's never played the game, that would have been a cool, wait, what?
First, you need to cut off my head.
Wait, what?
Way to end the chapter and draw them back in for the next one. But most of the time, it just ends mid-conversation and then just resumes the conversation on the next page. Or, mid-scene and then just resumes that same scene on the next chapter. There's no reason for the chapter break. But let's get into the real meat and potatoes of what I really want to talk about in this review. How the minor changes to a scene and to a story can completely change that scene and even future events. One of the things that is really important to consider when writing are the small things. Things like word choice, or those small little character moments which might seem unimportant at the time, but can completely change how you view a scene or how you view a character. And this book is perfect for this kind of discussion because although it tells the same story as the game, you can walk away with a completely different feeling on the events that occur. After all, a book is a painting made up of a bunch of tiny paintings. And with each tiny painting you change, the more the big picture is changed. To start with the easier one, let's go to word choice. Now, the best discussion of this lies within my Frozen review, I think.
Let it go, let it go.
No. The Frozen book by Melissa de la Cruz. In that book, Rukoi went into full detail about how an author would seemingly use the wrong word when describing certain scenes or actions, or how they would repeat words, or how their word choice was a very banal kind of sense, how it wouldn't say anything new despite using sentence after sentence to say it. The best example, I think, is when they tried to describe an electric fence as not being a physical barrier, even though if something can physically stop you, like if you step across it and it shocks the shit out of you, that would be a physical barrier. I also went a bit into it during my Night Flight review, with how the authors would just take random words that would denote dialogue and just toss it in any case, like they were clicking a randomizer every time they wanted to say something. The characters would snap, bark, holler, scream, and all sorts of things without actually making a cohesive tone with the rest of the scene. They would be having a normal, calm conversation, and then all of a sudden one character would be like, "Don't do that! No! No!" And then another character would be like, "Ha ha ha, that was so funny." The book does do this every so often, and it's jarring when it hits that. A good example in this book, when it comes to word choice specifically, is when the stranger first comes to Kratos' house. Now, when the stranger begins to pound on that door, demanding Kratos answer, we saw him approach the door. Here's how that scene plays out in the game.
Just tell me what I want to know. No need for this to get bloody. I thought you'd be bigger.
Do you see how Kratos walked, his shoulders squared, fist clenched at his side, with a purposeful stride towards that door after he hides Atreus? That's the look of a man who's prepping for a fight, who is anticipating whatever's on the other side of that door is going to come bother him and come bother his child. You can feel the apprehension as he walks. And just, a small side glance, absolutely masterful dialogue here. Because when Balder first talks to Kratos, you totally think he's talking about Kratos being Greek and being from the Greek pantheon. And you actually found out who Balder was actually there later on in the story. And you realize, oh, okay. It's just, I could gush about this game for a while. But here's how the book decides to do it. It describes him approaching the door, fists on his hips. Now, I get what he means is like it shows in the clip. Kratos has his fist next to his hips. But because he chose on instead of next, I'm forced to imagine Kratos strutting towards the door like this. You see how that doesn't quite elicit the same effect in a mental image? But more importantly, let's really get into the small changes, the real big problem with this novelization. The tiny little things that I'm sure Barlog added, thinking that it wouldn't matter much, but gives us a completely different image and tone for the novel. There were so many of these small changes that Kratos is almost a different character from who he is in the game. Or at least he is a character who has not yet disconnected himself as much from the ravenous reaver he used to be. For example, let's take the first meeting with Sindri into account. Here's how it happens in the game.
Hi, excuse me, but, how did you come by that, axe?
That is my concern alone.
And, while I won't dispute that, I know that blade. It was one of ours, but, we didn't make it for you.
Step aside.
I can't. See, the woman we made it for, I am quite fond of her, and I would be somewhat displeased if it turns out that you did something to her.
It was my mother's.
You notice how during that meeting, Kratos doesn't seem to regard Sindri as much threat. Even when Sindri holds up his fist, as if he intends to fight Kratos for the axe, Kratos never once actually moves like he's gonna attack the dwarf. He relies entirely on his intimidating presence and physical frame to try and get Sindri to back off, and almost seems to relax ever so slightly when it's revealed that Sindri is only trying to fight him out of respect for his late wife. He knows Sindri isn't a threat to him even if he did try to fight him, and thus doesn't need to do any more than this. And when Atreus steps in with the clarification of how Kratos got the axe, he has almost a sense of curiosity rather than anything else. Here's that same scene in the novel. Excuse me, he said in a tuneful voice, but how did you happen to come by that axe? The weapon held his stare. That is my concern alone, Kratos said. The man advanced across their path to block their passage. However, he appeared uncomfortable in taking such an invasive action. As a matter of fact, his timid face practically begged forgiveness for his move. And, well, good sir, I will not dispute that. I speak because I know that blade. It is one of ours. But we did not make it for you. Step aside, scrawny dwarf, Kratos ordered. The name is Sindri. I hate being addressed as dwarf. But that's what you are, Atreus offered as a plain statement of fact, which received an angry glare in response. But on Kratos' next stride, Sindri stood his ground, though his shoulders cringed while he stared up at a towering Kratos with stone-faced defiance. I will not step aside, Sindri uttered, with a force that proved larger than his side. See, the woman we made that blade for, he fumbled. I am quite fond of her, and I would be somewhat displeased if it turned out that you did something to her. So you wish to what? Take this blade from me by force? Kratos eyed the little man with an expression that bordered on ridicule. Rather, I would ask that you surrender it without a fight, Sindri countered plainly, swallowing his fear. You do not want me to have to hurt you now, do you? Kratos raised the axe, causing a cowering Sindri to shield his arms. It was my mother's, Atreus said quickly. She left it to my father when she died. Atreus prayed his comment might spare the little man's life. For the first time since encountering Sindri, Kratos shot a disapproving glare at his son. He needed no diplomatic response from the lad to deal with this one. Because Kratos draws this axe and actually threatens Sindri under the belief that Sindri would make a genuine attempt to try and take the axe from him, and then actually glares at Atreus when he tries to defuse the situation, he comes off more like he's malicious in this case. Almost like he was relishing the opportunity to bull someone smaller and weaker than him, and was annoyed when Atreus, being a more good-natured character, steps in to try to defuse the situation. Who no longer out of a curious, hey, how do you know this axe? But more of like, please don't kill him, Dad. Another example is when they meet Modi, one of Thor's sons who's been harassing them all game for the third time. Here's how it's presented in the game.
Thor, blame me. Me. For what you did to Magni. My own father called me a coward.
Looks like he did more than that. Move it, or we'll pick up where he left off.
I'll kill you. No. He is beaten. Not worth killing.
He should pay for what he said about Mother.
I said no.
But we're gods. We can do whatever we want.
That's what I said to your mother, right before I gave it to her. What are you doing?
This is a much better knife than Mother's.
In this scene, Kratos shows nothing really to the badly beaten Modi. Perhaps even a bit of pity, if at most, despite the man's two attempts to kill him and kidnap Atreus. Atreus is the one who interacts with Modi almost entirely, and it's used to show how the little godling is starting to swell in his own ego, how he's starting to lose his empathy, and more importantly, his humanity upon the revelation that he is part god. Now, here's how the book does the same scene. Kratos accelerated to gain a few strides over his son, remaining silent. At a turn in the worn path through overarching branches of elm and willow, they abruptly stopped. Modi wobbled near a deep chasm that flanked their right, except he was barely recognizable beneath the bruises and blood. Hunched over and limping with the aid of his sword, Modi approached. Through battered, swollen lips and labored breath, he did his best to force out his words. Thor blamed me, for what you did to Magni. My own father called me a coward. Appears he did more than that. Move away, or we take up where he left off, Kratos commanded, with no sympathy for the demigod. I will kill you, Modi said. Kratos only laughed when Modi attempted a hobbling step toward the boy. His beaten legs clasped beneath him before he came within striking range. Helplessly, he groaned, a useless heap of beaten flesh upon the cavern floor. This is not the reaction I can see game Kratos having. Even though Modi is an awful person in the game and novel, and even though Modi has been harassing them, Kratos isn't the kind of guy who I would see laughing at this kind of paternal abuse. Nor would he threaten to finish what was started by his own father. Even Greek Kratos doesn't seem the type of guy who would laugh at Modi. He seems like the kind of guy who would just ignore him unless he felt the need to kill him. And then he might say what Kratos said at the start, but I still don't see him laughing. Not only does this serve to worsen who Kratos is in the novel, but also stands to make him less sympathetic when he does scold Atreus for killing Modi. In the game, it's less about the fact that Atreus disobeyed his father to kill Modi, but more to show that Atreus is losing his humanity. He kills Modi not because he has to, not for survival, not in self-defense, but because he wants to. He's angry about the things that Modi said about his mother, who he himself was just disrespecting a couple scenes earlier in the game. In the book, because Kratos threatens Modi first and then laughs at his injuries, it changes the tone, and it feels like it actually is entirely about Kratos being mad at Atreus is being disobedient. But that leads to the next thing I felt was changed with all these little tweaks for the worse. Instead of Kratos being a truly loving and caring father, but being bad at expressing it due to his own traumatic past and his own experiences with his former family, both godly and mortal, this book kind of settles into Kratos doesn't like Atreus very much. I've already shown one case where Kratos actually glares at Atreus for interrupting his bullying of Sindri. There's also the scene on Alfheim, where Atreus begins to hear the voices from the light of Alfheim. Here's how it plays in the game.
I said nothing.
Weird. Could have sworn you said something.
What is it, boy?
Voices. You don't hear that?
I hear nothing.
It's going away now.
It was screaming. Lots of voices. Angry.
And here's the book version. What is wrong, boy? Kratos asked, an unwanted edge of irritation binding his words together. Voices. Do you not hear them? Atreus forced out while wincing in pain. I hear nothing, Kratos said. Panic took over. He had no inkling on how to deal with his son's plight. He heard nothing. Instead of showing immediate concern at Atreus in pain, doubling over at hearing the voices in his head, Kratos is explicitly stated as being annoyed first. In the game, Kratos is immediately going to check on his son. You can hear the worry in his voice. You can see the concern in his eyes. He's not annoyed with what's happening. He's concerned from the very start. Which, by the way, can I just gush with how amazingly this game is animated? I mean, just look at that. You can tell all that without any words. But anyways, the book removes a lot of these small bonding moments between him and Atreus. It removes that small Alfheim scene just before this, where Atreus runs over and tries to push the boat with his father. The scene where Kratos has Atreus help him push the giant stonemason's hammer down. We know that Kratos doesn't need help to do that. We just saw him push an entire temple across the lake. But Kratos does it because, like any father, letting his kid help to make them feel strong and better about themselves. And the charming scene where Atreus tries to teach Kratos about the Nordic runes in the Tyr Temple.
Atreus.
Come on. You already speak it. Learning to read won't be that hard.
I know how to read, boy. Just not this tongue.
You're halfway there already then. Okay, so the runes represent a lot of different things. Some gods, some animals.
Wait.
Oh, am I going too fast? Sorry.
Not-
These are all just taken out, so we don't see these nice little bonding moments. And while I could definitely understand the removal of most of the traversal dialogue, as there are so many that you probably would need half this book just to include them all, the book does suffer a fair amount for it. After all, these dialogues only serve to give us, not only serve to give us lore in a exposition-friendly way, but also show the characters bonding. I cannot buy that this Kratos in the book and Mimir ever become brothers in spirit that they do in Ragnarok. And more importantly, it doesn't feel like this Kratos eventually even really likes his son. Which is a shame because Kratos' struggles to be a good father to Atreus in this story is ultimately one of the most interesting aspects of the Norse saga. There's also the final fight with Balder, which is the perfect example with how these minor changes so completely warp a scene and what that scene is trying to tell us. Let's start from when Balder gets his curse broken.
What is that? I can feel this. I can feel everything.
He's vulnerable now?
If you didn't know, one of the more popular interpretations of the scene is that Balder, having fully realized that his feeling was returning to him, actually calmed down. We can see the thought process in his face. We can see the harsh features starting to soften a little. We see him turn towards Kratos. Not like he was going to start a fight immediately, but maybe to say something. Maybe even thank them for whatever they did, or spare them for further fighting. It isn't until his mother reanimates the giant corpse and intercedes once more that the fight completely reignites. It's a small scene that has multiple consequences. In addition to showing that Balder briefly might have had a moment of clarity, a moment of lucidity after his curse was broken, it shows Freya's greatest flaw, that she cannot let Balder make his own decisions, and that's ultimately what leads to Balder's death.
Your prophecy said he would die a needless death, and he did. Because you could not let him go.
She intervenes before the fight ever began again, and it might very well be because of that, Kratos ultimately ends up killing Balder. However, here's that same scene in the book. Balder stood unmoving, staring at his hand. Blood. What is this? Pain? He muttered to himself. The arrowhead and wood splinters stuck out of his fist at obtuse angles. His incessant laugh echoed off the nearby ridges. I can feel it, he announced. He reluctantly lifted his stare from his hand to the boy. A thin, and until that moment unseen, layer of magical protection that rendered him invincible became visible as it cracked, with shards toppling off Balder like sheets of ice. Freya's enchantment evaporated from Balder's body, while he flipped from hideous laughter to sobs of realization. The spell is broken, Mimir said. I'm going to apologize now. I cannot do Mimir's accent. The mistletoe was his weakness? Atreus said. He can be killed, Kratos asked. You've seen it yourself. He's vulnerable now. Kratos and Atreus drew their weapons, simultaneously advancing on Balder. No! Freya screamed, having regained consciousness. Now horrified, she stared from a distance. The arrowhead used to repair the lad's broken quiver strap had been mistletoe. One Freya missed when she burned the lad's mistletoe arrows back at her cottage. Kratos attacked, slamming his fist into Baldur's jaw. Yes! Yes! Baldur cheered, as if experiencing some ecstatic pleasure from the attack. Kratos pummeled him to the ground. Oh, the pain! It's wonderful! Atreus hastily launched an arrow at Baldur on the ground while his father retreated a step to recover his fighting stance. The tip winged Baldur's shoulder. Baldur let out a wretched scream, staring quizzically at the blood. I can feel it! More! Give me more! Baldur taunted. Kratos obliged. The trio are already back to fighting each other before Freya ever got involved. In addition, it changes the dialogue completely. Instead of Atreus merely asking a simple, he's vulnerable now? They extend the dialogue to make it seem like both Atreus and Kratos are hoping to kill Baldur, when in reality, that wasn't why they were fighting. It was all about self-defense. That's what most of the fights with the gods in this series is about, self-defense. In addition, the passage is written poorly, so it's hard to tell if it's Mimir confirming Kratos' question or Atreus doing it. And while you might argue the cadence fits Mimir best, I will remind you that Kratos does in fact say this in the novel. Kratos growled at being forced to endure this senseless banter. Guys, the eye. I don't know. To me, there's just something surreally dissonant about hearing Kratos refer to anyone as guys. Like, I don't know. To me, it just doesn't... It's just one of those... It doesn't feel right. It'd be like going up to Darth Vader and hearing him sing the Neko Neko song. Well, there's certainly a way you can argue that Baldur would have continued the fight in the game. After all, him doing this could be him cracking his knuckles, ready to fight again. It's undoubtable that Kratos beginning the fight once more removes that interpretation and removes the things they're saying about Faye. With that additional dialogue, it almost makes it seem like Kratos and Atreus are eager to fight it again, as opposed to the game where they specifically wait for Baldur's next action to respond. They aren't attacking him first, they let him choose. And Freya comes off less like a mother so overprotective she's not letting her own son make his decisions, but instead making a genuine attempt to protect her son from an assault on him. Based on the wording in the novel, Baldur doesn't even fight back for the first few blows of the renewed fight. So this was basically just a jacked 6'8" bald man with his son wailing on this scrawny looking guy. But it also removes the significance of this scene later on.
Stop. Please.
He's beaten, Father. Not a threat.
You will not come for us again. You will not touch her.
I don't need your protection.
It feels less like Kratos trying to better himself and separate himself from the god he was, trying to stop the cycle of terror and bloodshed that was mirroring his own before it truly started. How Kratos was operating on instinct and adrenaline, and it's only when Atreus' voice brings him back down off that Kratos remembers who he is now and wants to be, compared to the book. Finally free of the stonemason's attack, Kratos dashed at Baldur, clamping both his hands around the throat, tightening slowly to choke the life out of him. Freya, still weak and exhausted, watched from the ground nearby, unable to muster the energy to defend her son. Come on! Do it! Baldur taunted, the corners of his mouth inching into a grimace. Stop! Please! Freya cried, surrendering to the agony of her breaking heart. This must end, Kratos snarled. But he is beaten, father. No longer a threat. Something in Atreus' voice stopped Kratos in his tracks. He stared first at Baldur, then at his son. then back to Baldur. It was Freya's influence that tugged at his son's heart. Was Atreus allowing emotion to cloud his thinking? Was it the way he cared for Freya that made him wish compassion on this fiend? The old Kratos lived only to kill, and would have snapped this one's neck and then pummeled him until every bone in his body splintered. That Kratos could find no reason to let this monster live. But he was no longer that man. Hearing Freya's whimpers behind him, he yielded to the god he desired to be, rather than the god that he was. He released Baldur's throat. This feels more like he's being guilted into it by his son, since he had no intention of sparing Baldur at all. Therefore, when he spares Baldur, it's more like he was being pushed into it because of how Atreus felt about Freya, and then later tries to convince himself that's what he wanted all along. And then, when he comes back to stop Baldur, it's less like Kratos had to make a hard decision both times, and more like a bloodthirsty Kratos being guilted out of and then vindicated in his previous action. But let's see, that's another scene we have to talk about. Here's the scene where Baldur tries to kill Freya in the game.
Shots chin. Help yourself. Can you, mother? No matter what I do or say, you won't stop interfering in my life.
I was just trying to protect you. I've made mistakes. I know. But you're free now. You have what you want. Try to find forgiveness. We can build something new.
No. We can't. Because I will never forgive. You still need to pay for the lifetime that you stole from me.
I have paid. I have paid. But if that alone will make you whole, if seeing me dead will make things right, I won't stop you.
I know.
What? No, Father!
I love you.
Why do you even care? You could have walked away.
The cycle ends here. Must be better than this.
My points are only furthered by the method of kills changing. As you could see in the game, Baldur tries to strangle his mother. Not only does this serve to show that Baldur is throwing away his last chance to mend the bridge with his mother, his last chance to end this cycle of vengeance, it's meant to be uncomfortable. It shows how far gone Baldur really is. He's not solely just killing his mother out of a sense of broken vengeance. He wants to savor that kill. He wants to stare her in the eyes when the life fades from it, because it would give him the most satisfaction. That's how deep his hatred has gone. There's a reason that this is the way Kratos almost kills Baldur, and how Kratos later kills Heimdall. It's supposed to showcase how close Kratos is, and how he starts to somewhat slip back into his old self, justifying his fear that he'll become a monster again.
Brothers! Brothers! This isn't who you want to be!
This way, when Kratos walks over and pulls Baldur off, it feels more like Kratos finally accepted that Baldur will not amend his way, will never willingly end the cycle that he's set himself on. We must be better, he mutters to himself as he snaps Baldur's neck, showing that he's not making this kill out of malice, but out of mercy, not just to save Freya's life, but for Baldur himself, who's so mentally gone that nothing would fix the madman he's become before he's caused so much pain and devastation that he would hold the kind of guilt Kratos has for the rest of his life, if he ever came to regret it. Compare that to the book. Speaking in hushed tones so neither of them might hear, Baldur addressed his mother where she lay spent on the ground. You just can't help yourself, can you, mother? No matter what I say or do, you won't stop interfering in my life, he muttered, while he himself still lay battered in the snow. I was always trying to protect you. She stopped, knowing that she was just regurgitating the same old excuses. Wrong. I held on too tight, out of fear, but also out of love. It's not too late for us to build something new, Freya continued. New? No, we cannot. I will never forgive you. You still have to pay for the lifetime you stole from me. Do you not understand? I pay every day you hate me. But if my death is the only way to balance this wrong, if that alone will make you whole, I will not oppose you. Freya looked up. The sadness and acceptance consuming her face were more than any human soul could bear. But they meant nothing to a fiend like her son. Baldur loomed over her, his hands clutching a huge, jagged ice rock, posed to smash her head. I know, he said. I love you, she said in a whimper, now at peace with her destiny and her decision. Baldur drew back, his face lit up with a perverted gaze of sick satisfaction. In that moment, Kratos delivered a killing blow to the rear of Baldur's head. Blood gurgling from his lips, Baldur turned in disbelief. He released a strangled croak. The god of war leaned into Baldur's ear. You chose this end, he whispered. While no doubt a gruesome way to die, especially when wielded with a god with a strength like Baldur's, this is a less sadistic kill choice, regardless of the work the text is trying to pull to make it seem like it. When Kratos emerges, instead of grabbing Baldur from behind and pulling him away, seeming to make the tough decision to kill him, as he affirms to himself that he's only doing this because he has to end the cycle, Kratos just walks up behind him and strikes him in the back of the head. I assume with the Leviathan axe because the book's really vague for how the final boss of the game is killed. And then Kratos, his last words to his still living Baldur, you chose this, makes Kratos seem far more callous to the situation at hand. Baldur didn't choose this, at least not in his right mind. He can't choose, and that's what makes him such a tragic villain. Through Freya's own desperate attempt to save him from a needless death, she led him down the path where he became so mentally broken he couldn't choose anything else but her death. And because he never got to choose the path his life took, he died that needless death because he refused to let go of his hatred. Because he couldn't let go of his hatred. And while Kratos does say that Baldur did choose this path to Freya, it's more to affirm that Baldur would have never done anything different. That the life he was going to live after Freya wasn't going to be any better. It was going to be filled with bloodshed and carnage. It's the same way he lived now, except maybe even worse. He's saying this to someone who he believes need to understand that Baldur would have never walked a different path. That in the end, her death was just going to be a link in the chain that led to so much death. Do you see how such a few small changes completely changed the scene? And that's not to say all the changes that this book made were bad, at least not in concept. One change that I really liked at first, before I read the change of the final fight with Baldur, was that scene where you stumble across him in Helheim. Here's how that's presented in the game.
What you did to me. What you did to me! Ah! 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 I'm a coward. I'm a boy.
Now, I'm just going to sum up what happens in the book, so I'm not making this review too long. Instead of doing that in the book, we see Balder grab a plank of wood that was nearby somehow, and basically tries to bring himself to attack the phantom of his mother, where the phantom of himself failed to, only to be unable to bring himself to do it despite all the hatred he has of her. He drops it, falling to his knees and sobbing at his own weakness, or maybe at the realization that as much as he hates his mother, he can't bring himself to kill her, as much as he really wants to. This would have been a great scene. If the final fight had remained the same, we would have seen his attempt to kill his mother in that slighter version, like he was going in to caress her cheek only to end up strangling her, all that more surprising. It would show that his feeling returning didn't save him, but only furthered the hatred he had of Freya. Enough so that he makes the leap to finally kill her, something that he was unable to do in the far past and even a few hours ago. But there are a few more changes that I actually want to talk about. The one I can think of most that really does affect not only this game but later games is this scene. When they finally make it to Jotunheim and Kratos and Atreus realize their entire journey was prophesized by the giants. More importantly, Kratos sees something shocking at the end of it.
We're so close to the end now.
Yes. Yes, we are.
In the book, this scene is changed so the mule is destroyed, and Kratos can't tell who Atreus is crying over. He doesn't know he's fated to die during Ragnarok. As such, he's almost as in the dark as Atreus is. The reason this is terrible is because so much of Kratos' actions in the next game hinge on this revelation. It's one of the reasons why Kratos is so reluctant to start Ragnarok. It's why Kratos approaches his relationship with Atreus so differently in the next game. And it removes a great deal of the change in how we might have seen Faye. Before Ragnarok came out, a lot of people were wondering if Faye actually loved Kratos, or was merely a puppet master attempting to orchestrate the downfall of the Aesir, the only way she knew how. But there's also a fair amount of scenes removed for no reason. At least none that I could figure. For example, a lot of the scenes where Atreus starts to let his own godhood go to his head and swell his ego is removed. We only see small parts of it briefly before he's snapped out of it by Kratos. One of these very important scenes is when he snaps at Sindri.
I see.
Yeah! We're sick of hearing about little people's little problems!
The scene being removed makes no sense because it's important to the narrative. It not only serves as the catalyst that causes Sindri and Brock to finally make up, thus making it feel forced and sudden when they do make up in this book still, but also starting to show how Atreus is elevating himself above others. Little people, little problems isn't a slight at Sindri's race or height, but rather Atreus saying that because Sindri's immortal, Atreus shouldn't be concerned with the dwarf's issues, mirroring the exact kind of attitude that led Kratos to do what he did to the Greek pantheon. We see him disrespect his mother because she wasn't a god, showing how the little boy who loved his mother more than anything is suddenly turning cruel to her because she doesn't have his birthright. But I think the greatest shame is that it removes a lot of the actual bonding scenes between Atreus and Kratos, as I mentioned. One I didn't mention earlier was when Atreus insults Kratos, not understanding, believing that Kratos didn't love his mother as much as Atreus loved him. Because he doesn't understand that Kratos' manner of grieving is much different than his own. It shows a genuine bonding moment between the two and resolving their first conflict in a real mature way that brings a better understanding for the two to each other.
What do we know?
No, she was not there.
Not like you would even care if she was.
Mind your tongue, boy! Until our journey is over, one of us must remain focused. Do not mistake my silence for lack of grief. Mourn how you wish. Leave me to my own.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize.
No. Why would you? You do not know my ways. I know it has not been easy.
They also removed several of the hints that Freya secretly ensorcelled Mimir to not reveal anything he knew about Baldur, hinting that it was her son and that she was doing everything she can to protect him, including stripping vital information from Kratos and Atreus needed to protect themselves from him. So all in all, a 4 out of 10. Note that this is entirely a rating of the book itself. The actual game and story of God of War 2018 is an amazing one, and if it had been translated word for word completely accurately into this book, it would have been an easy 9 out of 10. Perhaps the closest any book has really gotten to 10 out of 10. But that being said, as a book, it's just not good. The writing is bland and far too direct to be interesting. The fight scenes are poorly written and feel like it's a nuisance for the author to write in general. And as the book is very much written with the idea that you've already played the games, there's no scenery to the book. We don't get a picture to any of the locales that they're visiting. If you were to go in this book without playing the game, you would literally just be imagining them walking through a blank background for most of the journey. And as an adaptation, it's even worse. With so many of those small changes that might have seemed like a good idea, or might have seemed like, oh, we don't need this, it'll just take up needless space, ultimately serving to change entire scenes and tones and ruin even future works. So when it comes to the question of whether or not it deserves Mount Doom, the answer is yes. Because this is not the way to experience this story. I honestly wouldn't recommend reading this book if at all possible for you to play the game. And even then, I don't recommend this book. I honestly would say watching one of those cutscene compilations on YouTube is a more enjoyable experience than reading the book. Which is unfortunate because this is an amazing story. And if it had been translated properly into the book format, you would have had it would have been great. But with that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. See you later, everyone.